I never imagined that a single chair, yes, just an empty chair in the living room of the home I grew up in, could ignite the unraveling of everything I once held sacred. That evening, during a family dinner in Greenville, Oregon, the town where I was raised, where I once believed family was unshakable, I arrived early, greeted everyone with the warmth I always brought, and sat by the window in the chair I'd always loved for its soft golden light. I didn't realize that seat had somehow become someone else's territory. And I certainly didn't expect to be slapped across the face, right in front of everyone by my sister-in-law, the woman I had once welcomed into this family with open arms. But the slap wasn't what cut deepest. It was the silence. The look on my younger brother Caleb's face, the same boy I once carried through thunderstorms and heartbreaks, told me everything I didn't want to believe. He didn't defend me. He didn't speak up. He stood there and sided with her. In that moment, something inside me broke. I felt the sting not just on my cheek, but in every memory I had of loyalty, of love, of what family was supposed to mean. I was ready to walk away, bury the pain, pretend it hadn't happened. But something wouldn't let me. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was exhaustion. Whatever it was, I picked up my phone and called the police. I had no intention of staying silent anymore. But before the officers even arrived, something unexpected happened. Something that would completely shift the way I saw everything. My name is Margot. I'm 48 years old, a lifelong Oregonian, and this is the story of how a single moment of humiliation led to a revelation, of how I uncovered a truth that no one wanted to see, and why I decided to finally, fearlessly, protect what little family I had left. Growing up in a modest home tucked along the outskirts of Eugene, Oregon, I used to believe that the bond between siblings was unshakable, something carved into the bones, weathered through time but never broken. My little brother Caleb was my anchor in a childhood that wasn't always easy. When our parents worked double shifts just to make ends meet, it was him and me, sitting under makeshift forts built from old bedsheets, pretending we were explorers sailing through far-off lands. I still remember how he'd clutch my hand during thunderstorms, his grip tight but trusting, and I would whisper stories to drown out the thunder, promising that everything would always be okay, that I would always protect him. That promise echoed in my heart for decades, long after the storms had passed. As we grew older, life naturally pulled us in different directions. I pursued a career in regional marketing and built a small but fulfilling life downtown, while Caleb ventured into logistics, eventually landing a job in Boise. Despite the distance, we made it a point to stay close. Weekend calls turned into holiday visits, and every time we reunited, it felt like no time had passed at all. He was still my kid brother, kinder than most, a bit too trusting perhaps, but genuine to the core. So when he told me he had met someone, a woman named Lacey, during a weekend conference in Seattle, I was excited for him. There was a glow in his voice I hadn't heard in years, and he spoke of her with a kind of admiration that was hard to ignore. "Margot," he said during one of our late-night phone calls, "she just gets me. You'll love her." And I wanted to. Truly I did. The first time I met Lacey was at our mother's spring cookout. She was stunning. Polished but not overdressed, articulate without sounding rehearsed. She knew how to command a room without stealing it. She complimented my dress, laughed at my father's worn-out jokes, and even helped clear the table without being asked. Everything about her, at least on the surface, seemed effortless. I watched Caleb beam with pride every time she touched his arm or leaned in close to whisper something private, and I thought to myself, maybe this is it. Maybe he finally found someone who will stand by him like I always have. For a while I believed she would, but slowly, and I mean with the kind of subtlety that makes you question your own instincts, things began to shift. At first, it was small, passive-aggressive jokes cloaked in charm. Like the time I brought my grandmother's famous lemon custard pie to Thanksgiving, something I'd made every year since I was 16. As I set it on the table, Lacey smirked and said, "Oh, I thought Caleb said I'd be doing dessert this year." The room went quiet for a moment too long, and though she laughed it off, I caught the way her eyes never quite softened. I brushed it aside, chalking it up to a simple miscommunication or maybe even nerves. I told myself not to be sensitive, not to read too much into things. But then came the offhand comments, sharper than they appeared. "You're still single? That's a shame. A woman your age shouldn't have to come home to an empty house," she once said while pouring wine like she was offering sympathy. I bit my tongue and smiled. Because what else do you do when you're the only one who sees the thorns beneath the rose? Over time, it became harder to ignore. Texts from Caleb that used to come every other day started to dwindle. He stopped showing up to our monthly brunches, always citing vague reasons: a scheduling conflict, a headache, Lacey's family needing him. I started finding out about family events after they'd happened, hearing about them secondhand from cousins or a concerned aunt who assumed I'd been there too. Something was shifting, and no one seemed to notice. Or worse, they noticed and said nothing. Still, I didn't want to be the sister who couldn't adjust, who made waves over imagined slights. I wanted to believe that what we had was stronger than one woman's influence, so I stayed quiet. I waited it out. I kept hoping that eventually Caleb would see through it, that he'd feel the distance growing and try to reach back across it. But the gap only widened. Then came the dinner, the same one where I unknowingly sat in her seat. And suddenly, all the silence, all the swallowed pride, all the moments I chose peace over self-respect culminated into that single humiliating slap. That was when I realized this wasn't just tension. It was targeted, calculated, a slow erasure of my place in my own family. And as I stood there, my cheek burning from more than just the slap, I understood that something had to change. I could no longer pretend I wasn't being pushed out. I had spent too many years holding my tongue, giving grace where it was never reciprocated. What I didn't know then, standing in that living room with everyone staring and no one speaking up for me, was that the unravelling had only just begun. And the truth I would uncover soon after would shake our family to its very core. At first, I told myself I was overreacting, that the uneasy feeling I began carrying after every family gathering was just the result of adjusting to a new dynamic, of learning how to share my brother with the woman he chose. I wanted to believe that the tightening in my chest wasn't real, that the things Lacey said were just awkward attempts at humour, and that I was simply being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew better. It started with the little things, the kind that are easy to dismiss when you're trying too hard to keep the peace. During our annual 4th of July cookout, I had spent hours preparing my mother's old recipe for deviled eggs, the one that Caleb and I used to sneak from the fridge before dinner was even served. As I proudly placed the tray on the table, Lacey leaned in with a falsely sweet smile and said, "Oh, I didn't realise we were bringing home cooking this year. I thought we were doing more contemporary fare." The words floated out like a joke, light and casual, but the sting was real. My mother chuckled awkwardly. Caleb didn't say a word, and though I smiled politely and pretended it didn't matter, something inside me curled back, wounded. Those comments didn't stop. They multiplied, evolved, and became sharper with time. They arrived wrapped in sarcasm, always with an edge too fine for anyone else to catch, or perhaps too convenient to acknowledge. At Thanksgiving, while I set the table beside Lacey, she looked me over and casually asked, "You're still on your own, huh? That must get quiet." Her tone was so disarming, so sugar-coated that even I questioned whether it was meant to hurt. But the look in her eyes told me it was no accident. As the weeks passed, she began invading more than just my dignity. She started quietly reshaping the space I once held in our family. Group messages I used to be part of suddenly excluded me. When I asked Caleb why I hadn't heard about our cousin's engagement dinner, he blinked with genuine confusion. "I thought you didn't want to go," he said. "Lacey told me she asked, and you weren't interested." I hadn't received any message. I hadn't been told anything, and just like that, I began to disappear. Not all at once, but inch by inch, erased by silence and implication. It was as if Lacey was rewriting my role in Caleb's life without ever saying it aloud. At first, I confided only in my journal, scribbling late at night when I couldn't sleep, trying to make sense of how I'd become a stranger in my own family. But eventually I found myself pouring my heart out to my oldest friend Diane, over cups of tea and shared silences. She listened, her brow furrowed with concern, and said something I hadn't allowed myself to think. "Margot, she's isolating you." I nodded, unable to argue, but still too afraid to face the full truth. I didn't want to be the bitter sister. I didn't want Caleb to think I was jealous, dramatic, or unwilling to accept his wife. So I bit my tongue. I swallowed the insults. I told myself that if I just showed kindness, eventually she'd stop seeing me as a threat. But kindness was never what she wanted. It became clear that her goal wasn't harmony. It was control. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled Caleb further away, and the harder I tried to hold on, the more isolated I became. Messages went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. And when I did show up to family events, I was met with those tight-lipped smiles, the kind that only ever reach the corners of the mouth, never the eyes. Lacey, of course, was all charm when others were watching. She'd loop her arm through mine and make loud declarations about how close we'd become, as if the tension radiating between us was all in my imagination. But when no one was looking, she'd lean close and whisper little barbs into my ear, just sharp enough to draw emotional blood. Still no +1. I guess some of us are just meant to be alone. It was psychological warfare, executed with such precision and grace that I began to question my own sanity. Was I really imagining it? Was I being paranoid? Or worse, was I the problem? That uncertainty became a constant companion. I stopped speaking up, afraid of sounding petty or bitter. I started arriving late to family dinners, finding myself hesitant at the door, rehearsing neutral smiles in the rearview mirror before walking in. I carried guilt I hadn't earned and shame I didn't deserve, simply for existing in a space that used to feel like home. The final straw, though, wasn't a whisper or a look. It was a text that never came. Caleb had promised to meet me for lunch, just the two of us, to catch up like we used to. I sat at the cafe for over an hour, checking my phone again and again. When I finally called him, he answered with a sigh, saying, "Lacey said you weren't feeling well. I thought you'd cancelled." That was the moment I realised she wasn't just trying to hurt me, she was erasing me. Systematically, methodically, with a smile on her face and a plan in her heart. And Caleb, my little brother, the one who once clung to my hand during every storm, was letting it happen. It was the cruelest kind of betrayal, not loud, not violent, but quiet, persistent, and so polite on the surface that no one dared speak of it. But I wasn't going to stay silent forever. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, one that sits heavy on your chest and coils around your every breath. That's the silence I felt walking into my parents' home that Sunday afternoon. I had arrived early, as I often did, thinking perhaps the quiet would grant me a brief moment of stillness before the performance began, before I had to smile through clenched teeth and pretend everything was fine. I moved through the kitchen, helping my mother set out dishes and fold napkins, the scent of her rosemary roast filling the air, momentarily masking the dread that had settled into my bones. I took my usual seat near the window, one I had chosen since I was a teenager because it allowed me to see the changing leaves in the backyard, a spot that, until recently, no one ever contested. But the moment Lacey walked in, the temperature in the room shifted. Her steps paused, her eyes narrowed, and within seconds her voice sliced through the air. "You're in my seat." I blinked, caught off guard not by her words but by the venom in her tone. "I didn't realize this one was taken," I replied calmly, already feeling the familiar eyes of the family turning toward me, not with concern but with that same look people give to avoid getting involved. It's always my seat, Margot, she hissed, barely keeping her composure, though her trembling hands betrayed the storm bubbling underneath. You know that by now. My brother Caleb, seated nearby, opened his mouth to speak, likely to downplay the situation as he so often did, but I held up a hand before he could say anything. It's just a chair, Lacey, I said, hoping to steer the moment back towards civility. Let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be. But that's exactly what she wanted. With everyone now fully attentive, she launched into a tirade so rehearsed it felt like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. You're always trying to undermine me, she spat, her voice tight with emotion. You insert yourself into everything, every gathering, every decision, every memory. You think just because you're Caleb's sister, you have some permanent place in this family. But you don't. Not anymore. I sat frozen. Not because I lacked words, but because I was stunned by the brutality of hers. My cheeks flushed with humiliation, not for what she said, but because no one, not my parents, not my cousins, not even Caleb, stepped in to stop her. I'm not trying to take anything from you, I finally said, my voice shaking, not from fear, but from years of grief I hadn't allowed myself to process. This is my family too. I've been here long before you came, and I've never wanted anything but peace. But peace was not something Lacey offered. Not that day, and perhaps not ever. Her words turned sharper, more pointed. You want peace? You should have left when you were still respected. But you just keep coming around, clinging to your past, acting like you belong. There was a silence after that, the kind that precedes a storm. And then it happened. Lacey took a step forward, and with a hand fueled by months of contempt, she slapped me hard across the face. The crack echoed through the room like a gunshot, followed by an audible gasp from someone. Maybe my aunt, maybe my mother, but I didn't look. My head turned from the impact, my cheeks stinging, my pride seared raw, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing through the pain, refusing to crumble in front of them. Caleb finally rose from his chair, his voice tight with shock. Lacey, what the hell are you doing? But she didn't respond. She stood there, chest heaving, defiant and unrepentant, as if the violence had somehow proven her place. I touched my face slowly, then looked directly at my brother. This is who you've chosen to defend. This is the woman you believed over me. Again and again. His eyes were wide, darting between us, torn between the life he had built and the truth he could no longer ignore. I didn't think it would go this far, he murmured, more to himself than to me. The moment fractured something in all of us. Whatever illusion we had maintained, that we could continue to pretend, to coexist, to preserve a family dynamic that had long since crumbled, dissolved right there in the silence. And then came the knock, firm, sharp, final. I had forgotten I'd called them, the police. I had reached my limit long before the slap, but I hadn't expected them to arrive at just that moment. As Caleb opened the door, 2 officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room with practiced calm. We received a report of an assault, one of them said, glancing from Caleb to Lacey to me. Can someone tell us what happened? Lacey tried to speak, but her words stumbled over one another, her face now shifting from rage to panic. It was nothing, really, just a family disagreement. But Caleb, sweet, broken, loyal Caleb, spoke next, his voice low but steady. She hit my sister. That's not just a disagreement. The officers exchanged a look before stepping further in. We'll need to take statements from everyone involved. As they began their work, the atmosphere in the room shifted again, this time not with tension but with clarity. I could feel the weight lifting, not because the pain was gone, but because someone, finally, had acknowledged it. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I had been targeted, cornered and harmed, and now, for the first time, someone had seen it for what it was. Lacey was eventually led out of the house, her hands cuffed, her expression still twisted in disbelief. Caleb stood beside me, silent, his eyes tracking her retreating figure as if mourning something he didn't yet have words for. I didn't say much then. I didn't need to. The truth had spoken loud enough. In the days that followed Lacey's arrest, I expected things to quiet down, at least outwardly. The silence I'd once dreaded now cloaked the house like a veil, but this time it felt different. Less like absence, more like anticipation. Caleb stopped reaching out, and the rest of the family, unsure of how to navigate the mess that had unfolded, retreated into polite avoidance, offering vague assurances or pretending not to have witnessed what we all had. I didn't blame them, not really. People are afraid of confronting the truth when it threatens their comfort. But I had already lost that comfort long ago, so I had nothing left to fear. Still, beneath the initial relief of finally being heard, lingered a gnawing unease, a feeling that the slap had only been a symptom of something deeper, something rotten that had festered beneath the surface far longer than I realized. The more I thought back on the months leading up to that night, the more patterns emerged. The missing texts, the subtle manipulation, the rewriting of events that made me question my own memory. And perhaps most alarming of all, the way Caleb had so effortlessly doubted me, not just once but repeatedly, even when I'd done nothing but try to hold our family together. It was Diane, my longtime friend and my compass in the storm, who finally asked the question I had been too exhausted to entertain. "Have you ever looked into her past?" she asked over a quiet dinner, her tone gentle but firm. "Not to dig for dirt, but to understand who you're really dealing with." I hesitated. It felt invasive, like crossing a line I swore I wouldn't. But this wasn't about curiosity. It was about protection. Not just for me, but for Caleb, and for the parts of our family that hadn't yet been corroded by her influence. So late that night, as the wind swept past my apartment window and the hum of the city quieted to a whisper, I opened my laptop and began searching. I didn't expect to find much. Maybe a few social media posts, a name on an old lease, a high school yearbook, but what I found instead unraveled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. There it was, buried in the digital archives of a county courthouse in Idaho. 2 separate restraining orders filed within the last 5 years, both from former partners, both citing emotional manipulation, intimidation, and in one case, financial sabotage. The language in the affidavits echoed with chilling familiarity. Isolated from friends and family, gaslit into questioning reality, eroded self-esteem through calculated cruelty. I sat frozen, the screen glowing against my skin like some harsh divine spotlight, illuminating the truth I had long suspected but couldn't prove. The woman who had taken my brother's heart and slowly poisoned the well between us had done this before. And she wasn't just controlling us, she was dangerous. The next morning I didn't go to work. I called in, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and stared at the folder I had compiled. Screenshots, case numbers, witness statements, all filed away in neat little digital compartments. I wasn't even sure what to do with it yet. A part of me wanted to drive straight to Caleb's house and force him to read every word. Another part feared he wouldn't believe me, that her influence ran too deep, and that showing him the truth would only drive him further away. But Diane, ever the voice of reason, reminded me that timing mattered, that if I wanted Caleb to really see, I needed to approach him not with fire, but with clarity. So I invited him over for dinner. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet meal like we used to share before everything got twisted. When he arrived, he looked tired, older somehow, as though the weeks of conflict had aged him in ways neither of us could name. I'd made his favourite, rosemary chicken with lemon potatoes, and tried to keep my voice steady as we sat down, the tension thick but unspoken. "I need to tell you something," I said softly after a few bites, "and I need you to hear all of it, even if it's hard." He looked up, guarded but open. Okay. I handed him the folder, not saying a word as he scrolled through the documents. His eyes narrowed as he read, his jaw tightening, his fingers trembling slightly over the screen. When he reached the second restraining order, he set the tablet down and leaned back, running a hand through his hair like a man realizing he'd been walking through fog for miles without knowing it. "Why didn't I see this?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "How did I let this happen?" There were a dozen things I could have said, but I chose only the truth. Because you loved her. Because she made sure you couldn't see anyone else. We sat there in silence for a long while, and though no apologies were spoken, something in that silence shifted. Not entirely repaired, but cracked open just enough for the truth to take root. The evening Caleb read through the file, all of it, was the moment something shifted between us, not instantly, not with dramatic declarations or tearful reconciliation, but in the way his voice quieted and his shoulders dropped, as if the weight of his own denial had finally become too much to carry. We didn't resolve everything over that dinner, but we peeled back the veil of illusion that had kept us separated for so long. And for the first time in months, I felt like maybe my brother was beginning to see me again, not as an obstacle or a threat, but as the sister who had always been in his corner. But illusions once broken don't disappear quietly. Lacey returned 2 days later. I didn't expect her to show up at my doorstep, but there she stood, pale-faced and tense, her eyes dark with something between desperation and fury. Caleb had apparently told her he needed time and space to process everything, which, to her, translated as betrayal. And now she had come to reclaim control in the only way she knew how, with intimidation and spectacle. "Open the door, Margot," she called out, her voice too steady to be calm. "We need to talk." I considered not answering. I considered calling the police right away, but something inside me, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was courage, pulled me toward the door. When I opened it, I didn't invite her in. She walked past me anyway. Caleb had arrived shortly after, responding to my text with a quick "get here now," and by the time he stepped through the threshold, Lacey was pacing the living room like a cornered animal looking for a way out or a new target. "So this is what it's come to?" she snapped, arms folded tightly, "dragging up things from my past and weaponizing them? That's real classy, Margot. You just couldn't stand to be second place for once in your life?" I didn't react. I'd heard too many versions of that line too many times, but Caleb's voice cut through the air, low and cold. "You lied to me." She turned toward him, wounded. "I didn't lie. I just didn't share everything. There's a difference." "There's a difference between privacy and deception," he said, the disappointment in his voice more powerful than any anger could have been. "You cut my sister out of my life, and I let you. That's on me. But everything you said about her, everything you did, it wasn't just wrong, it was calculated." Her eyes welled with tears, but not the kind that came from remorse. They were weaponized tears, part of a script she'd used before. "You don't understand what I've been through. You don't know what it's like to always be the one who has to fight for her place in the world." Caleb stepped forward, but this time his resolve didn't falter. "And that gave you the right to destroy someone else's." I watched her, waiting for the mask to fall, for some crack of truth to finally show, but all I saw was a woman who had spent her life mastering the art of control. Until now. She turned to me, the last shred of her restraint gone. "You think you're better than me, with your nice little apartment and your saintly act. You were always watching me like I didn't belong. You pushed him away from me. You poisoned him." I met her gaze calmly. "I never had to. You did that all on your own." For a moment the room felt like it might implode from the tension alone. But then Lacey did something none of us expected. She screamed. Not words, not accusations, just a raw, hollow sound that pierced the walls and made even the framed photos on the mantel seem to flinch. And then she lunged, I didn't have time to move, but Caleb stepped between us. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grab her. He simply said, "That's enough." It was the calm in his tone that stopped her, more than anything else. Her fury, once uncontainable, began to wither in the face of a truth she couldn't manipulate. She looked around the room, at the man who no longer followed her script, at the sister who no longer flinched. And she realized she had lost. That night, the police were called again, this time by Caleb. When the officers arrived, Lacey didn't protest like before. She didn't scream or deny. She simply sat on the porch steps, staring out at the streetlights with a hollowness I couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps she finally knew that the web she'd spun had collapsed. Not just around her, but through her. As she was escorted away for violating her bail terms, I looked at Caleb, whose face now held grief, not just for her, but for himself, for the years lost, for the trust broken, for the family nearly torn apart. He turned to me and said, "I should have listened sooner." And though part of me wanted to say, "Yes, you should have," I only nodded, because in that moment, blame was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was that the truth had finally stood up and refused to be silenced. In the weeks following Lacey's final arrest, everything moved quickly and yet with a kind of surreal stillness, as if the entire world around us had taken a deep breath and wasn't sure how to let it out. She was charged with multiple counts, including assault, harassment, and violating the terms of her release, and though the legal proceedings were slow, they were steady. And this time, her charm didn't hold sway. Her past had finally caught up with her, not just in court documents and testimonies, but in the eyes of the very people she had spent years manipulating. When the sentencing was handed down, 3 years in state prison, I didn't feel the rush of vindication I once imagined. I felt something quieter, heavier, but in its own way more powerful. Closure. Not because she was behind bars, but because I had finally stopped minimizing the damage she had caused. I had faced it head on, and I had done so without lowering myself to her level. Caleb struggled in the aftermath. He moved out of the home they had once shared and returned to our parents' guest house for a while, not because he needed shelter, but because he needed space. From the lies, from the noise, and from the shame that comes when you realize the person you trusted most had built an entire world on illusion. We spoke often, sometimes in long emotional conversations, sometimes in quiet drives to nowhere, and little by little he began piecing himself back together. I never once said "I told you so," because healing doesn't happen through blame. It happens through grace, through time, and through truth that's finally allowed to breathe. For me, the healing came in unexpected ways. In early mornings spent walking through my neighborhood in Eugene, where the air felt cleaner and the silence less lonely. In simple moments like planting tomatoes on my back porch or listening to the birds return in spring, I found a new rhythm, not one centered around defending myself or protecting someone else's illusions, but one rooted in peace. Diane remained my rock, never once letting me slip back into old patterns of self-doubt, and through her constant support, I realized just how deeply I had internalized the idea that being strong meant being silent. It doesn't. Being strong sometimes means raising your voice in a room full of people who would rather look away. It means calling out injustice, even when no one else is willing to stand beside you. And it means choosing to rebuild, not for revenge, but for freedom. Your own. There were still family members who tiptoed around the subject, who didn't know what to say or how to place their loyalty. I understood. Truth makes people uncomfortable, especially when it contradicts the stories they've told themselves for years. But I no longer needed everyone to take my side. I had stopped living for that kind of validation. And in the quiet that followed, something beautiful happened. I began writing again. Not for work, not for performance, but for myself. I wrote down everything. The pain, the betrayal, the silence, and the clarity. And I realized that the story I had lived wasn't just about Lacey or Caleb or even family. It was about reclaiming my voice after years of letting others speak over it. Now, as I sit by the window in my apartment, the same one that overlooks the park Caleb and I used to ride our bikes through as kids, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Not triumph, but peace. And with it, a kind of gratitude, not for what happened, but for who I became because of it. I'm not the same woman who sat at that dinner table months ago, hoping to keep the peace no matter what it cost. I'm the woman who stood up, who faced the truth, and who walked through fire without losing her humanity. Justice doesn't always look like a courtroom verdict. Sometimes, it's the quiet strength of choosing yourself, of standing tall when no one else sees the weight on your shoulders. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever walked through pain in silence, hoping someone would finally notice, subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge. You are not alone. And your voice, like your story, still matters. Share this with someone who needs hope, healing, and the reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your worth.